Nice deep breath, everybody, and welcome, welcome, welcome. It's been a while since my husband and co-author Vijay Bhat and I did some work together, and it feels I'm Nilima Bhat, the co-author of the book Shakti Leadership, and the other book I've written is called My Cancer Is Me with my husband Vijay, and we were wondering, how can we support uh, our community and anyone who wish to engage the whole idea and experience of death, and how can we help them through this time. So the reason we are doing this webinar is Vijay in 2001 went through colon cancer at the age of 40. I was 35 and the children were 8 and 11 years old. And I've been doing these Shakti dialogues with people from all over the world across different domain expertise for some years now. And I realized I would like to have Vijay on this webinar as a Shakti Shiva dialogue, if you please, and really get him to share his lived experience and gained wisdom and insight around the possibility of death through his diagnosis of cancer. And we went on to create an integrative medicine program to help other people recover from cancer. And Vijay now runs an online cancer coaching program for people all over the world to support them through their experience. So there's a lot that he can share, and death is death, and our experience of it, whether from cancer or from COVID, we still have to deal with the same experience, which is death. So what are the lessons that we can learn from cancer in this time of the COVID-19 pandemic? So that's the purpose of today's call. And a big welcome to Vijay. Before I get him to start speaking, let me just share how we're going to run this hour or so. It'll be experiential and interactive. It's not a typical one-way webinar. Use question and answer. There is a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, so you can put in your questions there, and use the chat box on the side for any other comments as they come up, but keep the questions for the Q&A box. And if we run out of time at the end and we don't have enough time to address the questions, we're happy to stay on longer for another 10 minutes. The typical way in which we approach our cancer work and all healing work is our workshops cover 3 tracks. There is information, and then there is discovery, and then there is recovery. So I thought we can follow the same process here. Information around, death and everything associated with it. Then some discovery around your personal relationship with death, and then some possible recovery to technique that can empower each of us to relate to death better. So that is, in a nutshell, how we are going to move through this hour. So the webinar is an experiment, and if there is interest to go deeper, we can do plenty more. This is literally like a little dim sum, because obviously this is the ultimate mystery of life, and we come in with this 1 hour really with a lot of humility, and let's all just set the intention that we step into this field, this space, with utmost sincerity. So with that, over to you, Vijay. Give us a deeper and wider overview about why now and why this subject.
Thank you, Nilima. So, first of all, big welcome to all the almost 50 attendees who we have on the Zoom call right now from all over the world. I can see our friends and various other people. So, why are we doing this now? Well, this global pandemic right now has already affected 5.5 million people, and about 350,000 people have died. As a result of this, death and mortality has suddenly become front and center. And my sense is that from our cancer work, we have seen that our society is really unprepared, both individually and collectively, to deal with death that is suddenly staring at us. And I'm also seeing that we are going through a transition. We are going from the initial shock to the acute crisis of the lockdown. Now we are realizing that it's no longer a short-term crisis, that it's a chronic, ongoing crisis. And we are beginning to come to terms with the fact that the world is going to irreversibly change. Now, this entire process is something that we see all the time in cancer. And so the whole idea that this may be a good time for us to examine and also shake loose. All of us have a relationship with death, whether it is implicit or explicit. And can we use this opportunity to shake it loose a little bit and to see what might emerge on the other side of that? So really that's the purpose of why we are together.
Thanks, Vijay. And I love the idea of a sound cloud to get a check-in from everyone. Would you like to go ahead with that?
Yes, so I'm going to request my colleague Aditya to put in the chat for all panelists and attendees. You will see a link in your chat. And what I request all of you to do is actually to just click on that link. And when you click on that link, you will go to a page, and I'm going to activate that page now. So what I would like everyone to do, I'm activating the page now and I'm going to share my screen as well. So all of you can see what's on my screen and you will see the page in front of you too. So what I would like everyone to do is actually to just contemplate the idea or the concept of death. And very quickly, very spontaneously, whatever are your top 3 emotions associated with the word death, I would like you to, in one word, just capture that emotion and then hit the submit button. And I invite each one of you to do 3 such responses. I'm going to make the screen full so that you can also see what is coming up from the 50 participants. Each one of you can put up 3 entries for what are the top emotions associated with death. Wonderful. So I can see fear, freedom, transition, wonder, sadness, anxiety. We are then able to see what's at the center, what most people are thinking. My request to some of the people who are putting the words in the chat box, please don't put them in the chat box. Please go to the link and put them into the link. The link that Aditya has shared. Aditya, can you please share the link again? Because I can see that a few people are inputting into the chat box rather than into the It's interesting, as you see this form, we can also get a sense of what's at the center, what most people are feeling, and what's on the periphery. What are some of those important things that people are feeling? For example, love, rebirth, work, awe, family, relieved. Freedom has come up more than once. So I'll keep this open for another maybe 30 seconds and then we will lock the screen. So it's important to see that all of us have a whole set of emotions associated with death. And perhaps we have not had the opportunity in the past to actually express them and put them up as a group and to see collectively what we are feeling. So another maybe 10-15 seconds, and then I'm going to lock the screen. Interesting to see words like void, baffled, mystery, uncertainty, mysterious, threshold, beautiful. Curious, excitement. Okay, so I'm going to take the liberty of stopping the share now so that all of you have got a sense of what your emotions are, and we'll be coming back to these three emotions later and what the group is feeling. So thank you for participating. I hope you enjoyed that.
Thank you, Vijay. Wow, what a quick deep dive into the subject. So it feels as if we're already there. We've already entered the field of inquiry. And so let's immerse in a more personal way. Vijay, I'd love you in a few minutes to tell us of your personal experience of confronting and dealing with the possibility of death when you had your cancer diagnosis.
Yeah, it's almost 20 years now, but I remember the day when my doctor told me that I had colon cancer. And my very first thought right then, right in front of him was, I'm going to die. And so actually my relationship with death started literally a few seconds after hearing the diagnosis of cancer. And because it was so immediate, that thought has stuck with me continuously. And another big turning point came for me when, after, as you know, after 2 years in Hong Kong, we had to make the decision to come back to India. And really at that time, the choice that was placed in front of me was really about life or lifestyle. And I find that very interesting because in the current environment, there is a big discourse and a debate going on between life and livelihood, which is kind of a version of this life or lifestyle dilemma that death puts us into. And obviously, the answer to that dilemma for me was very simple, which was to choose life and to say, we'll see what happens about lifestyle. So, since that day, I've been asking myself two questions. Question number one is, why do modern societies celebrate birth and mourn death? That here are two transitions that happen in life, and our reactions to those transitions are so different. In the case of birth, there is so much excitement, there is so much anticipation. There is a doctor, a nursing home, a midwife, somebody is going to just help this innocent little new life come into the world. There is so much celebration, people are waiting with chocolates and mithai and cigars and all of this stuff when it comes to birth. But when it comes to death, having lived the lives that we have lived, it's a completely different reaction. It feels like an ending. It's lonely. It's gloomy. There is nobody to actually help you cross over from that place into an unknown. And so it strikes me that our society has given a huge positive value to birth and consequently a huge negative value to death. And I suspect that much of the fear associated with death comes from this social kind of phenomenon. So this question number one. And question number two is, what can modern societies learn from traditional societies? Right? If you look at the traditional societies, they were closely connected with all the natural cycles of birth and growth and decay and death. And they had well formulated rituals and sacraments to mark each of these rites of passage. Right? We, for example, don't have the same thing. So to the extent that in these traditional societies, death was given a very important role in the pantheon right? So in India, for example, we have Yama, the god of death. And Yama is given a very powerful role in the pantheon. And we know the stories of Nachiket, who had the conversation with Rama to understand the mystery of death. We know the story of Savitri, who actually negotiated with Yama for her husband's life, right? So there are many such powerful stories where the god of death has an active role to play. Similarly, in Egyptian societies, there is Anubis, who is the god of death. And there are all these amazing stories about how you have to relate to Anubis. In other words, how you have to relate with death. The Tibetans, in their book of dying and in the book of living, talk about the idea of bardo, that what are the stages that you have to go through. So my sense is that modern societies have completely ignored this. And in a way, we are paying the price when we are confronted with a very dangerous contagion like we are dealing with right now. So I think that for me, my personal experience has gone from the very individual to this very broad societal kind of a view.
Thank you, Vijay, and thank you for reminding me about the Savitri story in a very strange way, not so strange way as the young wife of, you know, a 40-year-old husband. That was you. That was a myth that really strengthened me as you came through your cancer. You were my Satyavan. And we're still the energies of the Amavasya, the new moon right now, and it's called the Savitri Amavasya. It's the it's the new moon to Savitri, and here we are having a webinar on engaging death. So I love it when we get the wink from the universe and the synchronicity of the personal and the collective and the universal coming together. So on that note, Vijay, I'm of course reminded that our book, My Cancer Is Me, has an entire chapter dedicated to death, and you wrote that chapter. So could you share with us briefly what are the general principles around death?
Yeah. Um, I'd like to talk about three principles. And the first one is that it seems to me that within every human being, there are these two contrasting forces or energies. The first is the energy of what, as you call it, eros, which is the energy to live, the desire to actually experience life in its fullest, the desire to procreate and continue that experience of life. And then on the other side, there is also the energy of thanatos, which is in the Greek language, it means death. And so psychologically, what everyone has understood, the experts have understood, is that each human being has on one hand the urge to live, and on the other hand, there is this mysterious death wish that we want to flirt with death. We want to experience both the wonder of living as well as the mystery of dying. And because both these things are in with us, we see this very often in our work with cancer. And we have to actually help people to come to terms with that. So that's principle number one. The principle number two is that there's lots of research to show that people do not actually fear the event of the death. They don't fear death per se. What they fear is the likelihood of pain and suffering leading to death. And so again, because we have not unpacked this idea, because we have not understood this idea, there is a lot of confusion in people's minds that death is going to be very difficult, it's going to be very painful, there's going to be a lot of suffering. Whereas people who have had near death experiences actually describe the opposite. They talk about their near death experience as being very peaceful. Some of them describe it as being very blissful. Some of them describe it as being walking towards the light. And so therefore, in a way, I think instead of honoring this aspect of death, we have actually given it a very bad name. Again, very similar to cancer. And that to me is the second principle, that our mindsets around death need to change. The third and perhaps the most important principle for me is that there is the biological aspect of death, that I die or somebody dies. But the psychological aspect is not about death. I call it death's younger sister, which is loss. And so what the psyche has to deal with is the concept of loss. So again, when you explore loss, we realize that there are two kinds of loss. The first is what we have already lost as a result of falling ill or as a result of being on our deathbed. We may have lost our health, we may have lost our job, we may have lost our independence, or we may have lost our lifestyle. So that's already gone. So I have to confront that. The second thing that I have to confront is the future loss, because human beings make plans for the future. We see dreams and we have aspirations, we have visions, we see possibilities in the future. And all of that comes to an end and we lose the sense of future, the positive future that we had. But the third and most important dimension of loss is the loss of identity. So what happens to people is that my sense of I have an attachment to it. It's natural because this is my lived experience, and that the person that I'm closest to is my sense of self. And so when I confront death, what I have to contemplate is my own non-existence and the loss of my I. And so really the confusion that people have is not so much about the event of death, but about the psychological impact of death and this sense of loss. So really the challenge around death is to make meaning and to reconcile with the idea of loss.
Well, I'm already feeling, you know, this thing around loss. It's this. It's such a. It goes to that identity question, and we will process this for each of us as we go further. But kind of taking everything you learned through your personal journey through cancer around death, how can you help us apply that to the collective journey through COVID that is now taking place in terms of the deaths that are happening and what that is creating in the collective? What learnings can we extrapolate from your personal journey for the collective at this time, from cancer to COVID?
Beautiful, beautiful question. Actually, so much great work has been done on this subject. And I guess my role today is simply to bring it to light. None of what I'm going to say is original or unique to my experience. And so maybe it'll be of relevance to the others as well. So probably the best known framework around death, loss, and grieving is called DABDA, DABDA. And this was something that was created by a very great psychologist called Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Now, what she says is that when we are faced with shock and when we are faced with loss and when we are faced with grief, human beings all over the world react in pretty much the same way. So it starts with denial. This cannot be happening. This is simply a dream. I'm going to wake up tomorrow and everything is going to be okay. So if you think about the lockdown, for example, that we are all facing, this was a shock. And maybe for many of us, our first reaction was, hey, this can't be happening. It'll be gone tomorrow, right? And hey, let me pinch myself to see if this is actually true. So this is one way in which, the first way in which we deal with any kind of sudden shock, traumatic shock. The second is anger. The second A is for anger. And all of us have felt the anger, whether it's anger towards the Chinese, whether it's the anger towards our own governments, whether it's anger towards people who are flouting the lockdown, whether it's anger towards, maybe our family members for no rhyme or reason. But essentially what we are doing is we are reacting emotionally to a situation that we cannot deal with, and the next reaction is anger. The third reaction, the B, stands for bargaining. And now we try to get into some kind of a negotiation with that event or situation. So we might be saying things like, I will follow the lockdown, but in return, I want to be safe. I will comply with everything that I'm told to do, but in return, this is what I want. I will give my home help all the support that I can give them, but in return, I'm looking for this. And so there is an element of negotiation and bargaining that takes place. Then the fourth D, which is DABD, is depression. And my sense is that the entire world right now is in a state of mild depression. Because what has happened to us is that we have realized that all our resources, all our means are actually powerless against this virus. And that the virus has a life of its own, and all we can do is to manage it and harness it to some extent, but not beyond that. And that gives us a sense of our own impotency, and that gives us a sense of our own inability. And the response to how we respond to that is by having a mild level of depression. And if we are able to go through all these cycles consciously, then we might come to acceptance, which is the A, D-A-B-D-A. D for denial, A for anger, B for bargaining, D for depression, and finally acceptance. So I think that this lesson, which Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote for grieving or loss, and particularly in the space of cancer, is directly applicable for us to be able to see in the context of COVID. So this is, I would say, the one big lesson that I would like to share. The second lesson is coming from the experience of many people who have faced cancer and have thrived from it, who have come out of it very differently. They've not been victims, they've not been survivors, they've been thrivers. And when you ask them, what is it that happened to them? Because they also faced mortality, they also faced their own non-existence, they also faced the prospect of death. They also realized that the death statistics, mortality statistics in cancer are really deadly. But what happened? And what they will uniformly tell you is that death focuses life. And that when you really embrace the idea of death, it brings a new kind of perspective and a new kind of focus on life, how precious life is, how worthy life is, how wonderful life is. And what that confrontation does is that it forces these existential questions upon ourselves, which in our normal lives we may not attend to. Questions like, who am I? Where am I going? What is my purpose? What is my legacy? What is the meaning of my life? And so people who are confronting death, whether it is through cancer or whether it is through another illness or whether it is through COVID, have no choice but to actually address these important questions. And when you do, it becomes a platform for your own growth and development. So one is that it forces these existential questions. The second is that it forces us to examine what is essential and what are the frills, and can we shed the frills. Now look at us in the lockdown. We have no choice but to focus on what is essential, the basics, getting healthy food on the table, making sure that our lives are managed within the constraints that we have, right? We don't have the time, the bandwidth, the space for any indulgences, any frills. And people are coming to terms with it and saying, hey, if I focus on the essentials, it's not as bad as I actually thought it might be. And so the idea of death focusing life is that it makes us focus on the essentials. And the last, and for me, this is the most powerful thing, is that death is an opportunity to reset our clock. It's an opportunity to say, I can just go back to the beginning and start again. And so because of our confronting death, it creates the space for new beginnings that we might otherwise completely ignore. And so if we want to really do this, what we have to do is we have to examine our own relationship with death. We have to examine it in a holistic way. So just like we do in the case of cancer, or just like we do in the case of stress, or just like we do in the case of well-being, what if we were to examine death through the physical lens in terms of what's happening to the body? What if we were to do it through the emotional lens? How are we feeling about it? What if we were to do it through the mental lens? what is in our minds, how is our mind dealing with this whole mystery. What if we were to look at it through the relational lens, which is what is the prospect of death or the concept of death doing to various relationships, not just with people, but with situations and events and so on. And finally, and perhaps this is the most important one, how can we look at death through a spiritual lens, which is to say that what is the role of death and life in my relationship with spirit. So I think for me, if we were to bring these ideas to the concept of death and help our viewers today to be able to look at death through these 5 lenses, then I think we might have been able to shift something significant.
Thank you, Vijay. And this is what I'm now excited about, right? We've covered the information phase of our webinar, and let's step right into keeping an eye on the clock. Let's step into the discovery phase, where I want you to take us through this unpacking of our relationship with death at all these 5 levels. I invite everyone to get a pen and paper so we can get into our relationship with death and processing that.
Yeah, so
Over to you, Vijay.
while a few people are getting their pen and paper ready, my request is based upon what all I have shared so far. If any of you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can just click on it and you can type in your questions. So I invite, if you're finding it hard to do that, you can also put your questions into the chat box. But my preference would be that you put them into the Q&A. Okay, so as I'm going to talk you through the emotional, the mental, and the relational, and then I'm going to invite Nilima to speak to the spiritual and the physical, and we are going to do physical last, and you will see why we are going to do it last. My request is that I will explain. I will maybe give you a minute or so to reflect and capture on your sheet of paper just 2 or 3 bullet points with regard to that particular subject. Now, this is not for public consumption. This is only for you privately, so you should be free and frank with yourself. So let's begin. So let's look at the emotional side. Now, in your word cloud, you already captured your top 3 emotions. What I'd like everyone to do, maybe in the next 30 seconds to a minute, is to ask yourself, what is the source of these emotions? Where did these emotions actually come from? Your own 3 emotions. Let me give you some examples. In my case, one of my emotions came from experiencing the death of a loved one during my childhood. When I was just about 12 or 13, somebody close to me died, and that triggered off an emotional reaction. Or for another emotion of mine, it came from a story that I was told by my grandmother, a mythological story, which involved Yama, the god of death. So in your case, what might it be? For somebody else, it might be going to a cremation or a burial for the first time and suddenly coming in contact with this whole idea of death that was otherwise hidden from you. And in my case, my third emotion came when I started asking these uncomfortable questions, and all the adults around me said, shh, 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 don't talk about this, don't talk about this. This is not a good thing to talk about, right? So let me give you 30 seconds or so to just reflect on what are the sources of your emotions associated with that. Just capture a little bit, and maybe I'll ask Nilima if she would like to share something just as an example after 30 seconds. If she picks one example and wants to share what is the source of that emotion that she feels around death. So 30 seconds for each one of you to answer. Private reflection, individual reflection, nothing needs to be typed anywhere, nothing needs to be shared. Just examine the source of your own emotions. Where do they come from? What triggers them? What are they really about? So Nilima, can you say something about an example for you?
In my case, one of my words was curiosity. And I realized because of my yoga background and lots of reading around, Tibetan, Egyptian, Indic stories, myths around this, I'm genuinely curious to know what the experience of the death process can be like if it's done consciously.
Beautiful, beautiful. So I hope that gives everyone a sense of, what are the kind of things that we are asking you to reflect upon. Now, this was the first one, so it may take a little bit longer. In the next couple of ones, I'm going to go a little bit faster. So let's look at the mental side of it. Let's look at death through a mental lens, which means let's look at death through the thoughts, the beliefs, the assumptions, the attitudes that we have towards it. Not so much the emotions, but what's happening here with regard to death. So here are some examples of what people have said to us in the past. Death is final, said somebody. Or death is a release. Somebody said death is slow and painful. This is their assumption. Another person's assumption is death is a gateway. Another person's assumption is when I die, I will be judged for everything I did, for my actions. So 30 seconds for you to reflect on what are your top 2 or 3 reflections around death. What are the assumptions that you immediately go to associated with death? And again, I will invite Nilima to give us her assumption, any one assumption. It might have been covered before or it might be something different.
Should I answer?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so we hadn't discussed this, so this is new for me, but I'm liking this. My assumption around death is the idea of closure. I have this assumption that you have to achieve closure before you die. Do not take your unfinished business with you and your unhealed relationships with you. That's my assumption, that we must seek to achieve closure by the time we die.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you for that. And I hope that gives all our viewers, currently we have about 60 viewers on the chat on this call, gives you a sense of what are your own assumptions about the idea of death. The third lens that we want to talk about is the relational lens. And when we are talking about the relational lens and relationships, actually we are talking about those things that we are attached to. So, for example, some people are attached to their loved ones, people. Others are attached to their friends, their social circle. Some people are attached to their work, deeply attached to their work. Some people are attached to their material possessions. They are collecting things in a way. Some people are attached to the impact and the influence that they have. So I guess my question to all of you, 30 seconds of reflection, and I'm going to also ask Nilima to give us her answer, is which relationships will you miss the most should you lose them? In a situation where you lose all your relationships, which one will you lose the most? In other words, which relationship are you most attached to? 30 seconds, and then I'll invite Nilima to share her answer. Over to you, Nilima.
So obviously the first one is our nearest and dearest ones, our parents, my father, my mother. I've gone through that fear with you already, but yes, of course, it's still there, Vijay. And perhaps most of all, losing my children. That is something that I sometimes can't even bear to think of. So I'm assuming that's common for all of us. I was surprised on this reflection that something else came up, which is if I will lose my sense of purpose, that that would leave me feeling very lost and 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 purposeless and therefore sad.
Beautiful, beautiful. That is, thank you for that. That is, in fact, a perfect segue for us to go to the next part, which I'm going to hand over to you, which is to look at our relationship with death through the lens of spirit, the spiritual lens, and then follow that up with the physical lens. So, over to you.
Thank you, Vijay. So we processed our emotional stress around death, our mental stress around death, our relational stress around death. So let's look at our spiritual stress around death. And as Vijay and I were discussing this, we realized the real nub of it in terms of our spiritual um, stress is the inability of the average person to reconcile these two truths. One is our physical identity, that my life is finite, death is inevitable, and that we're all dying, some faster than others. This is a truth about our physical reality, our physical self. And yet, we also know the other truth, that is our spiritual identity, our spiritual self, that the insight and deeper sense that there is a part of me that is eternal, is infinite, is blissful, um, and it's all there. It's inviolable, it's indestructible, um, and and that life and death are transitions and phases, you know, of two kinds of being of self. So we are not able to reconcile these two identities, that am I a physic being who is always at the risk of dying, or am I an eternal, inviolable, indestructible self? So I guess the question to you here is, if you haven't really examined this more consciously in the past, to do so now. I want you to address the question, which identity, physical or spiritual, are you more attached to, and why? Let me repeat. Which identity, your physical self or your spiritual self, are you more attached to, and why? Go ahead and take 30 seconds. Taking a deep breath, welcome back. And I'm going to turn the tables on Vijay. Vijay, what's your answer?
Yeah, I thought that was coming. So, actually, 20 years after cancer, I'm not really attached to my physical identity anywhere near like I used to be. But the truth is that I am not yet at the spot where I am compensating or I am attached to my spiritual identity in the same way. So I find myself in that bardo. I find myself sometimes here, sometimes there, sometimes in the middle, sometimes unsure. And so, actually, my investigation is that between the binariness of the physical and the spiritual identity, is there something else that we could really be looking at, where there are shades of both, that it's a spectrum rather than a polarity?
Okay, maybe as we proceed for the next few minutes, some ideas for that may come up. So we go into the fifth level of being, of course, the most foundational one, which is our physical reality, our physical body, our physical self. So, what I want to share about this is that there is collective and accumulated trauma stored in our very cells, and this is somatic at a very somatic level. It's got nothing to do with your feelings, your thoughts, your assumptions, your beliefs, the meaning you're making. It's really a physical self. The cells at a very sensate level, at a sensory level, have stored the trauma of having experienced death as a species, at a species level. Your cells belong to the human species, and the human species has experienced death many times, and that sits like a PTSD, a post-traumatic stress disorder, inside the human soma, the cellular structure. Regardless of who you are and what your unique life experience has been, there is a species level trauma that is stored at a somatic level in our cells around the possibility of death and the experience of death, and wanting to hold on to life because life is so precious. So, when we experience trauma, it is typically something that remains undigested and unexamined. And it therefore, in Chinese medicine and yoga terms, it becomes like stuck energy. And it stops you from breathing the full and free breath of life. And it's somehow always borderline in your being, kind of holding you back from being your full, free self as you live through each moment. So, a very important part of processing our relationship with death and coming to any kind of more comfort and ease with that experience is to learn how to release the trauma of that past experience that is stored in us at a species level, in our DNA, in our cells. So, in order to do a little exercise around that, let's move right in and see what I'm talking about, and let's feel what I'm talking about at a very sensory level. So I invite you to re-experience one of your emotional or mental or relational stressors that you have jotted down in this exercise earlier. And if you just make note of it and look at it, I want you to let go the story or the event, whatever, and instead turn around and just notice and follow the sensation in the body. What are you sensing at a somatic level in the body? As you examine your emotional, mental, and relational stressors and triggers around death. I can feel it right now, but typically it is some kind of a contraction. It's some kind of a heat that starts building up in the body. It's basically the body trying to release the trauma because you're finally paying attention to that. So there is some kind of, there is all this stored trauma. I want you to make note of it. Please jot down where in your body did you feel the stress around death, as I called it out. Jot it down because that's a very important piece of information for you. That, this is where I'm storing trauma around death. So then you can go out there and do the work needed to release it. So what's happened with this global pandemic is that it has erupted in us this stored trauma at all levels, right? Physical, emotional, mental, relational, spiritual. And what that has done is this new piece of trauma around death that has come from the outside has opened as if a Pandora's box around all this earlier stored stuff. So what we are feeling now is this overwhelm of, oh my God, where's so much trauma coming from? And since we don't know what to do with it, we swallow it and stuff it right back. And my invitation to us is, let's move to recovery. Let's understand that if this trauma is rising, it is rising in order to be healed and released. This can be the medicine of the virus and the pandemic, right? So let's move to recovery. And in order to move to recovery, there are broadly three things. And this may answer your question, Vijay. I was thinking about this and I said, these three broad things to recover from the trauma that death represents. One is to zoom out and to kind of make meaning and find purpose in the trauma that helps heal it. This is what all the science and research shows. The other is to move through the emotional, mental, and relational stresses by grieving the loss of what death can bring. And the third is to zoom in very specifically into your somatic experience and to release the trauma that is stuck there. So zoom out to make meaning, move through by grieving loss, and zoom in to release trauma. So with that, I'm handing it over to you, Vijay. Can you take us through a recovery practice? We've done the information, we've done discovery, and now let's move to recovery. What do you have for us?
Thank you, Nilima. That was a wonderful synthesis and convergence of all that we have spoken so far. You took it, you zoomed out to the spiritual side, and then you zoomed into the somatic cellular level. So the recovery practice that I will be doing, which will take just a minute or two actually, comes from my experience of Vipassana. Many of you may know that Vipassana is the ancient Buddhist meditation technique. And when I went to do Vipassana for the first time, almost 15 years ago now, I learned there that everything is consciously birthing and dying. Whether you look at the stars which are exploding and birthing and dying, whether you look at nature which is exploding and birthing and dying, whether you look at your own cells which are birthing and dying, everything is going through the process of birthing and dying all the time. And if life and death are polarities, and we've talked about that, whether it's a physical identity, a spiritual identity, etc. If they are polarities, then my big insight through Vipassana was that impermanence is the sweet spot. That the whole idea that nothing lasts, everything is constantly birthing and dying at the same time, and to have an awareness and understanding of it was really the secret that the Vipassana technique tries to address. So what I would like to do is to maybe lead you through a 1-minute practice only, which is working with the breath. And this is again coming from the Buddhist Vipassana tradition. It comes from yoga pranayama. Breath, because breath is our constant. As we are living, we know that we are living because we are breathing. Breath is the connection between what's happening to us internally and what's happening to us externally. So what I would invite everyone to do is to sit comfortably in your chairs with your feet firmly planted on the floor. Relax your body. You can place your palms on your knees facing up or down as you feel fit. Your eyes are closed, and I'm just going to invite you on a little guided meditation, if you like, which focuses on the breath. So what I invite you to do is, as you inhale, I want you to hold the thought that I am receiving life. At the end of your inhalation, I invite you to hold your breath just for a second or two with the awareness, I am holding life. Then you exhale. As you exhale, the thought is, I am releasing life. And after exhaling fully, you hold and you say, I am holding life. Let's do it again. Inhale, I am receiving life. Hold, I am holding life. Exhale, I am releasing life. And hold, I am holding life. And one last time. Inhale, I am receiving life. Hold. I'm holding life, engaging life. Exhale. I am releasing life. And hold. I am holding, engaging life. Just notice what's happening with you internally as you do this. This, to my mind, is probably the simplest and the most powerful practice that we can do to constantly toggle between and integrate both these two mysteries that are part of the human experience: receiving life, releasing life, receiving life, releasing life. When you're ready, you may open your eyes and welcome back.
Thank you, Vijay. I realized when I was holding life, when I'm receiving and releasing, and on both ends, the holding, I felt like I became the space, the container in which this process can happen with equal ease and non-attachment. So thank you. And so we've done a lot. We have a few last minutes. In closing, could you help us synthesize our overall relationship with death? And also perhaps get a sense of our key takeaways and learnings.
Well, the key takeaways and learnings are really for the participants who've been listening in and doing all the hard work. But I guess if I had to summarize everything that we have said so far, it really comes down to these three things. The first is that, as you said, Nilima, that we can't let the fear of dying stop us from living. And that even if we have this stored trauma, and even if we have all these difficult emotions, and even if we have all those assumptions, then we have to take some active steps to address them. Otherwise, we are going to be letting the fear of dying come in the way of living. So that's one. And second is something that, as you and I know, we heard from Father Lancy 20 years ago, is that if we can die before we die, we can truly live. Now, this doesn't mean that we physically die, but there can be parts of us that can die, that no longer serve us, that can be let go. And can we identify what are those things, in which aspects of our life can we die before we die, so that we create the space for the new beginning and for the living. And so I guess my last question to the participants of this webinar is, what aspects of your identity are you willing to let go and let die? I'll repeat that. What aspects of your identity are you willing to let go and let die? And that brings me to the end of what I had to say. Thank you very much. How would you like to close?
Well, I know you have a quick closing poll for us. Do you think we have time for that? You get,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So what we'd like to do is to just have a quick closing poll for you. And so the first thing that I would like everyone to do is that in the chat box, if you can please put down your answer to this one simple question. What was the most valuable thing for you in the last 60 minutes? What was the single most valuable thing for you? Can you please put that down in the chat box? I'll just give it maybe 30 seconds so that you have a chance to simply blurt out what you think was your aha. Thank you, Neha. Thank you, Ashwini. Thank you, Rajesh. Thank you, Anju. Thank you, Vijay, Christina, Francisca. Moshmi, thank you. Vipka, Archana. Wow. Thank you for that. Please keep going. You can keep adding those elements as you go. We had said that we would keep this to 1 hour, but I know that there are some questions to be answered. So we will do a poll, and then those of you who want to stay on to do the Q&A, we'll be happy to stay on for another 10-15 minutes. So I'm going to request my colleague Aditya to put up the poll, and you can see the poll, and it's a very simple single question. So I invite you all to just pick for yourself the extent to which your relationship with death shifted in our session today. So far we have about 30 people having voted. $35 as of now. Please keep going. Just a single vote. Don't hold back. You're welcome to say blah if you like. Another 10-15 seconds for voting. Thank you. That's excellent feedback for us. That I'm going to end the polling. Aditya, can you please end the polling and launch the results so everybody can see what the... Yeah, so it looks like about 44% of you felt a significant shift. About a third of you felt a small shift. About 15% of you felt a fundamental shift. And 3 of you, 8%, were blown away. That is amazing. Thank you very much. And Aditya, you can shut down this poll for now. Your comments are still streaming in, and you're welcome to keep doing that. I'm just opening up the questions and inviting Nilima to have a look at the questions and see which one she would like to answer first, and then pass some on to me.
There's a question about the suddenness of a unknown event. I don't know do you have a sense of Kalyani? I don't know if that's a question you want to elaborate on a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's really about the shock, and maybe you want to say something about the shock. When death happens, or when a life-threatening event takes place, there is a suddenness of something that is the unknown. And I suppose, how can we deal with that? The second question from Suresh is also, I think, similar. How can you deal with the sudden loss when you have not had the time to take care of unfinished business, work, thoughts, etc.? So I think it's really about the suddenness and the pressure that you feel because you may have procrastinated or ignored or neglected. So if you want to say something about that, Nilima.
Yeah, I mean, this I will have to give a spiritual answer to those of us who believe that the soul is eternal, it lives on. There are wonderful channels, people who do this work of helping you connect with the soul of a loved one who has passed on and with whom you may have unfinished business. So I really feel we should find a good instrument, and I'm fortunate I know someone like that. And when in family and close relationships, I know someone has died leaving something unfinished, and that is still causing a lot of pain in those who are still living. I have gone to such a person, and asked to dialogue and meet with the soul of the loved one, and ask all those questions that were sitting and hurting us on the inside. And the answers we got, I believe, achieved closure. That it wasn't just us who are still living who needed to hear those answers from the soul who has passed, but I also got the feeling that the soul who has passed is not able to move on their journey if they haven't completed and sought forgiveness or given forgiveness. So this whole theme around forgiveness and unfinished business, there, thank God that there are such facilities available, and I'm happy to share the name of the person I have worked with. You can send me one-on-one separately or email me on that.
Uh, I think it also, this point also addresses the third question, which was with the death of a loved one, you can feel a sense of guilt and failure that you may not have done enough. How does one get past that? I think that has been answered. So somebody has asked or made the comment, the summary of the breath exercise by Nilima, that the body is a vessel which takes in, holds, and lets out. At the end of the day, we are all mediums and vessels for the soul to carry forth. Thank you. That's a great reinforcement and affirmation. The question, how do you heal somatically? I think this one is for you. Once you feel the physical sensation. So when you experience that sensation of your relationship with death somatically, what can you do after that? A great question. So Nilima, I think this one is for you.
Yeah, this is good old, not good old, this is the beautiful Vipassana and core somatic integration by Dr. Rajiv Naidu. That's really all you have to do. You to heal it, you have to feel it. So once you find that contraction, to not try and quickly tell a story about it, to not quickly try and fix it, but to just rest your awareness and your attention without any fear or judgment, to just be with it, to just breathe with it, to just pay attention to that sensation, the body automatically is constantly healing, suck energy, and looking to release and make it flow again. So all you are doing is making that process conscious, and sit with it long enough till you notice that not good sensation becomes comfortable in the body, and you find a sense of ease. You may find that the sensation shifts somewhere else. Maybe it moves from your head to around the chest area, in which case gently move your awareness to where the new sensation around death is. And then again, witness it, watch it, be with it, breathe with it, without trying to actively fix it. Let your breath, your body do what it naturally does, which is process and digest undigested energy. Let it just do that until it goes somewhere else. So stay with this process and follow the sensations. Notice and follow every sensation. Be with it until it can dissolve. It's almost like a piece of ice that, with the heat of your awareness and the gentle flow of your breath, that stuck ice energy kind of melts and starts becoming the river of life inside you again.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for that. Uh, this one is also for you. How did you personally manage Vijay's near-death experience? And the second question, which is related, is, and Vijay, how did you personally manage your emotions on the impact that could have been on the family? I think so. Nilima, why don't you go first and I'll follow.
I think the way I managed it is, I've been blessed with lots of faith. I have no idea where it comes from. Maybe it's a past life thing. So I just went into faith and prayer and storming heaven, and just saying, this is not what's going to kill Vijay. It's going to heal him and grow all of us. And I had many signs to tell me that. So I rested on my faith. I stood on my faith.
So my answer to the question which is addressed to me is that the assumption that I have handled all my emotions is actually not correct. I think my emotions continue to overwhelm me sometimes even now. And what has worked for me, I think, is to have extremely good help in the early days of my cancer. And so what really helped me was to be given this big, broad, holistic view that look, it's not just about emotions, it's not just about thought, it's not just about your relationships, it's not just about your finances, it's about you as the whole person. So what I find is that my way of dealing with it has always been to try and take the whole person view. And when I take the whole person view, it gives me a different perspective. And it helps me to deal with any one of those elements that may be out of kilter, which happens to me all the time. So all I have to do is to step away, zoom out, as Nilima said, and really focus on the whole person. Um, let's see. Even in Hindu scriptures, when we know that our ancestors do come back and take rebirth, why do we find it difficult to let go?
Yeah,
Uh,
this is a spiritual answer, you know, that when we come into this body, there is a self-forgetting of our divine nature. And we get completely entangled in the Maya, the illusion, the dream that somehow this is finite and death is finite and so on. So, you know, we forget our eternal nature.
the whole world is confronted with death. How can we heal the world? Or is death a personal and not a collective journey?
I would like to think that it used to be, may have been a personal journey for which communities and collectives have found some meaningful ways to process it. But I feel with this COVID, the time has come to actually address it collectively. And this little webinar is one little step from just the two of us. And what if suddenly the more and more people around the world actually sat down to think about death at a collective level, and how do we process the idea of death? And this is where we can start looking into, where is evolution going? Is life, decay, death a done deal? Are we as a species forever just stuck in this cycle? Is there a way out of this? And maybe some of us can then look into what some of the masters have done around immortalizing the body, the work of Mother and Sri Aurobindo, that says a time will come where we will evolve as a species to actually transcend death. Of course, we have to include death before we can transcend it, and we have to, learn not to be attached to life or death. But a time will come, according to some prophets and yogis like Mother and Sri Aurobindo, who actually say one day there will be a divine life in a divine body. So that will happen at a collective level. Who knows, 100, 200, 300,000 years from now, in the evolution of the body, the human body, these things may be possible. We know our cells are as yet expressing a fraction of their potential. So we may well have many more potentialities and capacities sitting in us at a somatic level, which could include uh, not having to go through the process of death.
Thank you. The next question is, why does it take death to realize the importance of life? So let me
Go
take
for it.
this one.
Yeah.
Uh, so I have seen this pattern where, that for any true synthesis to arise, it needs a thesis and an antithesis to actually interact. And so for me, it just feels as if well-being and illness, or life and death, or even in-breath and out-breath, for us to understand the significance of one, we need to put it into the context of the other. And so I know from personal experience that my own relationship with life changed when I was in a life-threatening situation with cancer. So I suspect that this is nature's exquisite way of balancing out and making sure that we don't lose sight of that which is important by always giving us the polar opposite to consider. The beautiful part, as Nilima just said, is that when this interaction or this collision between thesis and antithesis takes place, if we can wait and watch and be attentive and be present, some new synthesis arises. And so I guess what we have tried to do in today's session is to give you both sides of it, the life and the death, and then give you the framework and give you the practice so that for you, some new synthesis may actually arise as you reflect and as you go deeper into it. We have been speaking about fear and loss associated with death. I have come across a case where the death of the most loved person was celebrated, having completed the purpose in life. It really moved me as it was very different from the custom. Any comments?
Well, I would say that here is an example we can all learn from. That here is a family that seems to have a very mature attitude to death, and the fact that they could do this and in a way become a model for others to emulate. Wonderful. It's good to hear that this happens. And we have also, all of us, if we think about it, have experienced funerals and wakes, where we have seen a lot of grace and beauty with which death is handled.
And the last question is, when the emotion is very overwhelming and strong, it is very difficult to just witnesses. What do we do then?
Vijay.
Shall I take that one? Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So what you've said is absolutely true. And our emotions actually rule us and drive us much more than we think. I know that personally as well, and with all the work that we do. And really, it's a question of, again, as I said before, looking at ourselves from all sides. So, my way of dealing with it is to allow it to pass and then to process it. So, I find it hard to process my emotion as it is happening, it's too strong. But I do have the capacity to process it very soon after. And so my way of doing it is to do it very soon after. There may be other people who are better than me at catching the emotion before it becomes so overwhelming. Great, I have something to learn from them. So I think my answer to you, to Arusha, who has asked this question, is notice what happens before and after, and where your best opportunity to process and to learn from that experience. Maybe that is one way to go. I found meditative practices like Vipassana and so many others that we have done also to be very useful. So I would highly recommend that you try some of those if you haven't already done so.
So, on that note, Vijay, let's just take a pause and sit back, and everyone take a nice deep breath. And perhaps a good way to start closing this is to recenter, return to self, step back from the field that got created and give thanks to it. And I thank you, Vijay. I thank every single person who joined us and all the beautiful comments and questions. Thank you to Rishi and Aditya for being such wonderful tech support on this program. And everything comes from peace, abides in peace, and returns to peace. May that be the intention and the aspiration and the prayer we end with. You can join us in chanting Om Shanti. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. May the healing response of this process and experience happen in states of deep sleep and with ease and grace for everyone.
Thank you, everyone. And may we honor death, not fear it.
Thank you so much, Vijay. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.